Hi, we have Joe with us today to have a short interaction on relational TA. Welcome, Joe, and thank you for your time. I'll let Joe introduce herself, about her work and practice, and more about her.
Okay, so I'm a psychotherapist, a TSTA. I work in Dunedin, Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm working in a full-time private practice, and I also run a small training institute in transactional analysis.
Thank you for your introduction, Joe. Today's topic is relational approach in TA. We in SAATA community are building knowledge around it and trying to establish competence around this. So it will be valuable to have your inputs on this. So I have a few questions and I would like some inputs and comments from you that will help us. According to you, what do you think is the core of relational approach in TA?
Okay. Well, I think my first response to that is that I don't think there's any one approach that we could call relational TA. So I think it's a broad umbrella term that a number of different practitioners, clinicians would identify with and perhaps use in quite different ways. Broadly, I think most people who would identify that with that term relational are referring to the idea that relationships are central to human development, to the development of psychological problems, and to healing processes or any processes of change. I could probably say a little more if
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so that's probably the broad sort of concept. For me, one of the key elements of working with relational theory is the idea that external relationships, family background, the environment, those key caregiving relationships are internalized in a way that shapes the psyche and then shapes our perceptions of ourselves, others in life.
Okay.
Because I've worked a lot with child abuse, trauma, it's been a theory that for me acknowledges the significance of those real external events at the same time as providing some of the depth of a more psychoanalytic approach.
Okay. It's interesting you say that because what you're saying is that the relationship influences our script and then you're bringing back the focus in this approach that relationships can transform the script.
Yes.
And borrowing your own words from the workshop.
Yeah, kind of a shift from that more cognitive behavioural kind of an emphasis that I think was the predominant mode of practice by that first generation of transactional analysts. So the idea that if a child decides her script, she can redecide. Yeah, my thought that a relational approach shifts that idea to something like, well, if relationships form script, then they can transform script.
It actually is a very intriguing idea because we always are caught up in analyzing the client's script and how do we get them off the script. And now just the perception of having therapeutic relationship as a way to transform the script is very intriguing and quite inviting, I must say, in this approach. Thank you for that.
For me, I suppose it does have quite specific meanings in that a relational approach assumes that the therapist is no longer playing a neutral or objective role with the focus on analysing what's going on within the client, but instead I'm trying to use my own experience, or what might be termed countertransference, my subjective experience of what's happening, to try and understand the client's script at a deeper level.
Yeah.
So usually that means, I think for most people using that term relational, more of an emphasis on emotional processes, interaction in the present, in the here and now, on unconscious processes, and less reliance on cognition and insight.
Yeah. It's got me thinking from the workshop and just this discussion about, in hindsight, we are human beings as therapists, so we have an experience with client and how best we could use that experience for healing for the client and maybe for our own selves, right? So it's very, very inviting to think like that. So thank you for that short snippet of idea of relational approach. and what you think about it.
Mm.
That brings to one more idea, one more comment that Byrne made, that which can be easily misunderstood, that if you're focusing on relationship, are we talking about building a good relationship, like a happy relationship with the client? It can be easily misunderstood.
Yes.
So your
Yes.
comment to clarify that bit would help.
For me, the term relational, doesn't imply creating a happy, feel-good relationship.
Yeah.
It's not talking so much about the quality of the relationship or the use of empathy or attunement, which I think it is understood by some practitioners in that way.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it is more about a theory that acknowledges the way the external experience is internalised, and it refers to a method where I'm using my own countertransference in a way that's, I hope, I suppose acknowledging that there's two minds, two scripts, two people in the room, and that both are contributing consciously and unconsciously to that process. So it's acknowledging that and trying to use it in some for the client's therapeutic gain.
Okay, that's good clarification, because sometimes it can be about the quality of the relationship, which Byrne said you need to leave it for their personal lives, personal relationships to do that. We as therapists are skilled.
That idea we talked about in the
workshop, yes.
If it's love that heals,
yes.
I think Byrne's quote was, they'll leave that to lovers.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, so you reinforce that in a very methodical way. So thank you for that as well. How does this approach and philosophy of thinking relationally complement or not complement classical and redecisional methods, which we already have?
I think how it might sit aside, it's a different approach. So it's probably up to the individual practitioner to what extent you might integrate or just use different approaches. But it is a different understanding. Redecision therapy, as I understand it, was an attempt to minimise the transference. I think that was Bob and Mary's Goulding's intention. So the focus is on what Mary would call, I think, the powers within the patient. So the focus is on intrapsychic processes. A more classical TA does rely on a more cognitive behavioural approach, the use of the adult ego state. So relational work is definitely working with transference and countertransference. So it is a different approach, but I think can still be used alongside those other approaches.
Do you use complementing of any other approaches in your practice?
Yeah, I would still do some redecision work occasionally.
Okay.
Yeah, I still think it's a powerful technique, and if it seemed appropriate in the moment, I might well do. Well, I still do use that method. I still teach it to trainees.
I think that kind of your views are helpful, because as a learner myself and many of us in the community in relational approach, we can be tightly compartmentalizing the approaches and say we need to learn this differently, learn this differently. I'm sure there is technical differences and academical differences within these approaches. I think to know that I can complement and use it at times, and I need to be mindful of it, is very helpful. And that's what you're saying. You do use redecision sometimes.
I suppose I'm always thinking in terms of the transference and countertransference. So yeah, I'm still noticing everything that happens within that process, including the transference toward me.
Okay.
So maybe the way I use it is a little bit different to a very pure redecision approach.
Okay. So you're developing your own style to redecisional, and that's what you're encouraging.
I think it's just the way any individual practitioner is going to integrate various approaches.
Okay.
I suppose I use ideas that are outside transactional analysis as well.
Okay.
But at some level it's integrated within me according to my background experience and ways I work now, and that evolves, it changes.
Yeah. I think what I'm hearing and reinforcing for myself is the constant learning and integration, and make it my own style and make it my own meaning of these approaches, instead of getting dogmatic about this how I must do and this how I must not do. What I'm hearing is that I can experiment, be in supervision, and then evolve my own style.
Yeah, to me as a trainer, that's what's important, is encouraging trainees to develop their own unique form of practice in a way that is congruent with their own background and experience and personal values.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's quite interesting, Joe, what you're saying. It's quite a relief for us, as for me at least, when I'm hearing this. It just gives me expansion in, looking at the perspective, relational perspective itself differently. So, yeah. There is also a belief and talks about relational TAs going back to psychoanalysis when Byrne wanted to move out of psychoanalysis. Would you have comments on that? What is your view on that?
Okay, well, I suppose my first thought is that it's going forward rather than back. I think it's a development of our methods and thinking and theory. As far as I understand, Byrne used transactional analysis in groups initially to develop what he called social control over symptoms and problems, but that he often moved people into one-to-one therapy where it seemed he was using the couch and more traditional psychoanalytic techniques. So, Byrne was challenging the psychoanalysis of his day, and he was challenging the authoritarian expert role of the psychoanalyst, and he was, the emphasis was on mutuality and contracting. So for me, a relational approach to transactional analysis, I think, moves us further in that direction, in I think a slightly more radical direction. We're thinking about equality, mutuality, contracting, but what we're adding to that is the idea that the therapist's unconscious is also going to be contributing to that process, that it's not a one-way street.
Okay. It's really accounting for the unconscious process and the impact the therapist has with the client. And making meaning for self as a therapist and for the client, and how it is valuable for the client's healing at this moment.
Yeah, and I like the way you put it, that it's acknowledging that the therapist or organisational consultant is also human, so that we bring with us our own scripts, vulnerabilities, anxieties, as well as our expertise. What I'm reminded of, what you shared in the workshop, that Byrne thought in the group there are each other impact from their own scripts, and in the couples he look at both of them impacting each other from their own scripts. However, he thought there wouldn't be much of an impact between the client and the therapist. So maybe some idea around that, if you can give, maybe for clarifying that bit. Yeah, so we were talking about psychological games in the workshop, and the way he describes games outside the consultant room as more bilateral, two-handed, but that inside the therapy room, he would have assumed it was a mistake, an error for a therapist to get caught in a game, and the aim was to detect the con and confront, or at least stay out of the games. So from a relational perspective, we're assuming that sometimes unconsciously, inadvertently, a therapist may get caught up in that dynamic, and rather than thinking of that as an error, that we can see it as something inevitable, actually that it does provide useful data. And sometimes perhaps the only way of really understanding the client's unspoken truth. Something that can't be put in words, or is just not conscious. So it can only be enacted in a therapy relationship. And I think by that enactment, what we discovered also yesterday, what we understood also in the workshop, is that it gives a quite deep meaning of what client is not able to communicate otherwise in their own conscious. So it's quite an intriguing thought to know that, we get impacted in psychological games can inform so much. Instead of treating it as an error, if I look at
examining my own countertransference with a client, it's very helpful. And that's what you say about bilateral games.
Yes, yeah, I know, well, from my own clinical experience, I think that, yeah, I do get caught up in those processes. Sometimes only after that I can see, but at that point I can use the what's been relived or replayed in quite a live way between client and therapist, yeah, in order to understand the game or the script and relate it back to the family of origin.
Yeah, it's a new thought for me, in a way to build that expertise, to hold such a frame while working with clients.
Well, I think it's new for all of us, so we're just experimenting with what relational meanings, ideas, what that might contribute to transactional analysis. Or
Yeah, that comes to my next point as if you don't have therapists who don't have psychoanalysis background, how does one develop the skills to work in this approach?
Well, for me, I was using psychoanalytic supervisors have been for over 10 years now, and that certainly contributed to my understanding of ways of using transactional analysis in a more psychodynamic. So I think that's probably important to have supervision with somebody who is familiar with using psychodynamic methods. And I did a lot of reading of the American relational psychoanalysts. I suppose I began reading that kind of thing in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it just chimed quite deeply with my own clinical experience, and in a way that more classical psychoanalysis didn't work so well for me because of the focus on internal processes and what looked to me like a minimising of real external trauma, social, cultural contexts and real experience.
Okay. So what I'm gathering from this is just to have a supervisor, some more training around building a psychoanalytical frame of looking at countertransference, not classical but more relational psychoanalysis. Just being in supervision helps, and my own work, I think, personal therapy around working with a relational therapist would help me also deepen the skills.
Sure, yeah, it would be a really personal, live way of getting some understanding.
Yeah. Just an extension to that question is, if we look at the history of relational approach in TA, there is a misconception or a myth which I carried for a long time, that it started after the deconfusion model from Hagedorn and Sills, which was published in 2002 in Taj, the child ego state. So I would like some inputs from you on the history, how it evolved itself, because we may get stuck that that's the source. So
okay, yeah. Well, I think it's a broad approach, and it's been developed differently by different people in different places. So as I understand it, when Charlotte Sills and Helena Hagedorn wrote their book on relational TA, they weren't familiar with the American relational psychoanalysts. They were drawing strongly on a large body of research which showed that it's the quality of the relationship, regardless of modality, that seems to be effective. So their emphasis was more on the quality of the relationship, the use of empathy. Sills and I have done a lot of joint work together and done some writing together and a number of workshops, so we've been both developing our own ideas individually and together over the last few years. But yes, my thinking around a relational approach probably drew more on the American writers.
It's good to know for us that it didn't start just there. It's an evolution, and it's in work in progress.
Yes, and I think the Italian therapists have a different approach again. They've
Okay.
historically had a strong psychoanalytic sort of a leaning. So that, the writers coming out of Italy at the moment using the term relational are drawing on the work of Moiso and Novellino, but taking it more toward, I think, what's sometimes called intersubjective field theory. Yeah, so I think there are probably lots of differences.
Yeah. I think for us as a community and for me as an individual to know that it has contribution from different authors and different perspectives is very helpful. Then I can lean on to reading and expanding more than getting caught in one model. So it's really demystifying the history of relational approach in TA. So thank you for that information, Joe. Do you have something to share?
No, I was wondering if you had further questions.
I had one last question. Maybe it'll have multiple questions further. What would you think the clients would benefit differently working with a relational therapist than any other therapist? Like, for example, a classical therapist or redecisional therapist who identify themselves as pure classical or pure redecisional.
I don't know, it's a good question. Being mindful of that research I've just been citing, which has been replicated many times. What we know is that modality doesn't make a whole lot of difference.
Okay.
It's the way perhaps an individual therapist's skill in using any one approach. I think that the research suggests that certainly knowing one approach well makes a difference. But maybe it's also a client's preference.
Okay.
Clearly it means using that live relationship in the moment. It's using here and now experience, so perhaps it's a more challenging way to work for a client, but the ideal is that it does provide a very vivid reliving of script rather than relying on experience being talked about outside the rooms. It's relying on that here and now experience, which we do know, again, there's research that shows that it is profound emotional shifts that create change. So there's the opportunity for it, but I guess it depends on the skill of the therapist ultimately and the fit between client and therapist.
Yeah, I think what you just said summarizes what you earlier said, that using maybe in the workshop or in the interview right now, that using the relationship as the vehicle for change, like using the relationship to transform the script of the client and maybe mine in further development. It just summarizes what you said about the benefit for the client in a way, because you were using live relationship in that process.
Yeah, it's certainly the ideal.
So any further inputs that you have for a learning or aspirational practitioner who want to develop relational approach, perspective, before we close the interview, Joe?
Yeah, I think just appropriate supervision, and I don't think it's something that can be taught in a couple of days workshop like we've just done. I think it's relies on an understanding, of the subtle nuances of learning to use transference and counter-transference. Good quality supervision, reading has been helpful to me, talking with peers who are also experimenting with these ideas.
Thank you, Joe, for your time and your knowledge, sharing from your experience and giving us time for this interview.
It's a delight talking with you, Deepak. Thank you.